Welcome to the Knoy Church podcast. We're glad that you're interested in connecting through this teaching time. If you'd like to connect further, feel free to reach out to us through our website, knoychurch.org. For now, enjoy this teaching from Knoy Church, where our mission is to lead people into a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
So what is Romans? Well, Romans is a letter written by a guy named Paul, the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul wrote between 8 and 13 what we call books of the Bible. Now, these books of the Bible, in reality, they're letters. And sometimes they're letters to a place, and sometimes they're letters to a person. For instance, the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy are letters to a young pastor named Timothy. And these are, Paul is talking about things that he knows are going on. He knows Timothy. He's been with Timothy. He knows the church, which is located in the city of Ephesus. And so Paul is answering questions. He's dialoguing with Timothy. And while these letters are written to Timothy, Timothy is ministering in a city called Ephesus, which might sound familiar because we have this other letter that Paul wrote that we call Ephesians, which is a letter to the churches in Ephesus. So 1st and 2nd Timothy help us understand Ephesians, just like Ephesians helps us understand 1st and 2nd Timothy. They work together to give us a good picture of what it might be like to be in the city of Ephesus. Which means that for some of these books, there's a dialogue happening. Somebody has asked questions that Paul is responding to, and we only get one side of the conversation. Imagine if you got into somebody's mail and you read a letter that they wrote to somebody. You would get one person's side of the conversation, but not both people's sides of the conversation. Now, Romans is just a little different because Paul's never been to Rome. Or he's never been to these churches in Rome, I should say. And so Paul is running this letter, and it's a pretty full-fledged development of his theology, of his belief system, of what it means to follow God. He's not writing in response to other person's letter. He's writing out these instructions for what it means to follow God. Which means that for some of the books of the Bible, for some of these letters that Paul wrote, when he's talking to a specific person or in a specific place, He's very specific about what certain things mean. And when he's talking in the book of Romans, it's much more general. He's heard some stuff, and he's going to respond to it. For instance, we've been talking about power and privilege. Paul has heard that there's some sort of a disagreement. There's like an ethnic issue. There's a class issue. There's a Jew versus, or Jewish Christian versus Gentile Christian issue. He's writing to that, but he's not been there. So he's not addressing specific people necessarily. He's addressing a situation. And that helps us kind of give a framework to what is Romans and who is it actually written to? Is there things that we can infer today? And the answer is absolutely. There's a lot we can infer today, because this is this full-fledged, fully developed theology that Paul is giving us. Power was wielded by these emperors called Caesars. Caesars claimed to be gods. They claimed to be divine, or they claimed to be the son of God, or it is very much like the way that Pharaoh would have thought of himself when Moses interacted with Pharaoh in Egypt. He would have been divine as well. So Caesars, these emperors of Rome, they were divine. Caesar Augustus actually coined the phrase, "There is no other name under heaven and earth which a man can be saved except Augustus Caesar." So you can see they think of themselves as divine, as gods, as even little gods. In fact, Caesar Augustus says that the news of his divinity was the good news. It was the gospel of grace and mercy. All right? So they have big heads, and they have this authority that is almost, at least in their head, divine. There's an emperor named Claudius, and Claudius kicks all of the Jews out of Rome. And then you might ask, well, why did he kick the Jews out of Rome, Nick? Well, because, and we've talked about this before in previous series, but the Jewish Christians and the Jews didn't get along. In fact, the Jews of the day try to make as much trouble for the Christians as possible. They get them in trouble all the time. They're accusing them of things. They're calling them out. And so Claudius, this emperor, he is so done with all of the turmoil. Because every time the Jews and Christians get into a fight, who has to break it up? Who gets involved? Rome. And so he kicks them all out. They are gone. You're out of Rome. Everybody who's a Jew, you're out of here. But here's the thing. 5 years after he kicks them all out, well, Claudius dies. And when he dies, his rule, his decree that all the Jews need to leave Rome, it dies with him. And so 5 years after that, the Jews begin to return to Rome. And so you have Jews and you have Jewish Jesus followers, Jewish Christians that returned to Rome. And what do they find? They find that a whole bunch of Romans have started to follow Jesus. There's these Gentiles, these non-Jewish folks, these people who they didn't grow up hearing about Yahweh. They've been introduced to God, and now they're following God, or at least claiming to follow God? No. This can't be. Especially because these Gentile Christians don't follow the rules. And so Paul is writing this letter to a mixed group of Christians. Some of them are Jewish ethnically. They've grown up with that. Yes, they love God, they follow God, but they're Jewish. And then you have these Gentile Christians who also follow God. And the Gentiles, they're not eating kosher. They're not observing the Sabbath day, at least on the right day. They're not practicing circumcision. There's all these things that are part of the law that the Jews were given, and that this group of people who are Jewish Christian believe you still have to follow. You see, they still believe they're under the law. There's this checklist that they still have to follow. You still have to check these things off in order to be considered a God-fearer or a God follower. And now you have these Gentile Christians who claim to follow Yahweh, who claim to follow the same God, but they are not following any of the same rules. And so now we have these disagreements. You have Gentile Christians who don't feel the need to eat kosher, who don't feel the need to observe the Sabbath on a specific day, who don't feel the need to be circumcised, and they look down upon the people, like these Jewish Christians, who follow all those rules. And then these Jewish Christians who follow all the rules, they look down upon the Gentile Christians saying, your faith isn't even real. You're not really a God follower. But Paul, he kind of stands in a place that no one else stands in. Because Paul is a Jew. He grew up. He's a Hebrew. He introduces himself in many of his letters as a Hebrew, as a Jew. He was a Pharisee, which means that he went through all the schooling to memorize the Torah, to know Scripture by heart, to be able to teach it, that a rabbi would go through. Okay? So he's well-versed in Scripture. He is a Jew by birthright. And yet, Paul's belief system looks a lot like these Gentile converts to Christianity. Paul doesn't actually believe that eating kosher is what matters. He doesn't actually believe that the Sabbath being practiced on a specific day is what matters. And so that's part of what Paul is bringing to the table to say, look, I've been there, I've done that, but you're focused on the wrong stuff if you're just worried about that and you're not worried about things like loving your neighbor. Which is why he goes on to say at the end of Romans, everything that Jesus taught, all the prophets, all the law can be wrapped up with love your neighbor. You're focused on this stuff and you're missing this. And so he wants to bring that to the table. Now, Paul comes up with these names for these two groups of people, and that's what we've been talking about in this series. He says the weak and the strong. And because Paul is both a Jew and he's in that world, but he's also in this world where he believes what the Gentile Christians believe, Paul is the only one that can really say, here's who the weak are. The weak are the Jewish Christians who are still stuck in the law, but try to follow Jesus. The strong are these Gentile converts who have their focus in the right place on loving their neighbor and not stuck in the law. And so Paul begins to give instructions to the weak and the strong, and that's who the weak and the strong are. Did you ever notice how we often think we know more about a particular subject than we actually know about a subject? There's this social psychologists have come up with this theory called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And essentially what it's saying is that you always overestimate what you know. So if you're a person who knows nothing about a particular subject, you're actually better off than a person who knows a little bit about a particular subject. If you know nothing, if you come across two people who are talking about soteriology, or they're talking about brain surgery or something that you know nothing about, you can't really enter into the conversation. You pretty much have to admit the fact that you know nothing. But if you know even a little bit about the subject matter they're talking about, you enter in believing you know way more than you should. So the Dunning-Kruger effect talks about your confidence level. And when you know a little bit about a particular subject, your confidence is the same confidence level as an expert in that subject matter. When your confidence is at the same level as an expert, it's called being at the peak of Mount Stupid. I know, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But that's the social scientists' term for this whole thing. You're at the peak of Mount Stupid when you know a little bit, but you think you know a lot. And when you're at the peak of Mount Stupid, you're unable to see that you're at the peak of Mount Stupid. So if you're in that particular setting or that situation, you don't actually know that you're there. That person is not in a posture of learning. They're in a posture of teaching. And so they are being an expert, or think they're an expert, or they have the confidence of an expert, and they're teaching others even though they really should still be in the posture of a student. Person who is an expert often realizes how little they know, how little they know in the grand scheme of things. Person who's playing at being an expert never sees it that way. They're at the peak of Mount Stupid and they don't know it. Now, Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 21 say this. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will, and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of truth and knowledge, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Paul is trying to help us understand that if you really do know something, if you really are in the position of being an expert, if you really do understand something, if you're in the position of being an expert, then you're the one with power. You're the one that's in the privileged situation. And if you are that person, then you can't expect the weak to come to the powerful. You can't expect the person who doesn't know to suddenly figure it out. You can't expect the person who's at the peak of Mount Stupid to realize that they're there. Instead, the strong, the powerful, the privileged, we must go to those who have less power, who are weak, who are underprivileged. Paul is also trying to help those who are in the weak position understand that they can't be so judgmental of those in the strong position. Just because they believe something differently doesn't mean that they can be judgmental of that person or believe that their faith isn't real or that they don't follow the same God. There's going to be differences of opinion. Remember, this whole book can be summed up with the idea of, hey, come to the table as siblings. So there are steps for both the privileged and the non-privileged, the powerful and the not powerful, the strong and the weak to take. But the onus, the responsibility, the call of God is on those in the strong position to come to those in the weaker position. Because, and it says this in Romans, we don't think of ourselves. If we're in the strong position, it's not about pleasing ourselves. It is about the other-centeredness. I mean, Jesus did not please himself when he came and died on a cross. We talked about that last week with our Easter service. The point was that Jesus gave up power and gave up privilege to come to where we are. That is the whole incarnation. Jesus, God put on flesh, came in the form of man. Jesus gave up everything to come down to us. Literally powerful, giving up power and privilege for those who are less powerful, for the weak, for the underprivileged. We are called to do the exact same thing. In Romans 14, Paul says this, I am convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Okay, so Paul is saying, I am convinced that there is nothing wrong with taking part in X or believing that X is okay, or that it, and you fill in the X blank. We've talked about Sabbath, we've talked about kosher food, we've talked about a variety of things, okay? Paul's saying, I'm convinced that there's nothing wrong with those things. However, if I encounter somebody who is convinced that there is something wrong with X, then I need to treat it as though there is something wrong with X. Because for them, there is. I can't just go doing whatever I want in front of them because it's going to cause them to stumble. In this particular situation, they're the weaker one. And if I was in the situation of being the weaker one, I would want them to treat me the same way. I would want them to treat my beliefs with the same amount of respect that I'm trying to treat them with right now. So if I encounter somebody who believes that something is wrong, something is sinful, I'm not going to argue with them because I could argue them right out of the kingdom of God. What I'm going to do is respect them, love them, and care for them. And by the way that I treat them, they're going to know that I love them. I'm going to be loving my neighbor. And in loving my neighbor, I'm loving God. But there are still these people who are stuck in the idea of law, stuck in checking off a checklist of things that they have to do, or they have to be about, or they have to follow. Otherwise, they're going to lose their salvation. And so Paul is writing not just to the strong, not just to the Gentile Christians to say, you got to figure out a way to do this better and accept those who have different beliefs than you. He's also writing to the Jewish Christians to say, look, there are some flaws in your logic. If you believe this, well, let me show you what that's going to get you.
But what if you start as a lawbreaker and then you begin to follow the law? I mean, what if you're not born into a Christian family? What if, like in biblical times, in this Roman letter, what if you were a person who was a Gentile, non-Jew, didn't grow up with any of these laws and this information about God, about Yahweh, and you converted over to Christianity? You became a Christian. So what if you're one of these Gentiles, these non-Jews that have come to know the truth and then to trust in God? Romans 2:26 says, so then if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? Well, not really circumcised, right? Because the law is rigid, it's unforgiving, it doesn't leave room for grace, it's flat.
Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law,
you have become as though you have not been circumcised. Paul says essentially, you want law? I'll show you law. Law's really simple. It's done. It's over. There's no grace. You break the law, you are a law breaker. It's like bashing this phone to pieces. It's broken. It's broken. You aren't putting it back together. If you break the law, you're a lawbreaker.
The law can't change itself. The law has its place, don't get me wrong. Romans 7:7, it tells us what the law is for. The law is to point out sin. Paul says, I wouldn't even know that I'm a sinner if it wasn't for the law. So the law has its place, but the law can't put what's broken back together. The law can't change itself. It takes a person. And so grace comes in the form of a person named Jesus. Jesus is the only one that can take this broken mess and make it whole again. Which means, folks, there's way more room at the table than we think. If your table, if your spiritual table, if your understanding of what it means to be a Christian isn't big enough to include people who were once outside of the law, were once outside of Jesus' grace, but are now inside Jesus' grace, then your table isn't big enough. I'm not even sure that your table is one that looks like Jesus' table. There's more room at the table than we think.
I want you to think for a moment about the table. A table in a house somewhere. The table is decorated very nicely. A lot of care has gone into crafting the table and taking care of the table. But that table is limited by the number of seats that are at the table. As we consider all that we've been talking about today, all that we've been learning, we are saying that the table is big enough for people that we don't think should belong at the table. Now look, it's going to take work to make your table big enough. You have to take the things off of it. You have to pull it apart. You're going to have to make room for more pieces to extend your table. It's going to take work, and then sometimes it's hard work. It's painful work. But it's rewarding work. Because your table is big enough for that extra leaf. It is big enough to put one more piece in. It is big enough to include that other person. You know, that other person. The one that Jesus came and was always ministering to. The one that Jesus sought out in the middle of the crowd. The one that everybody else judged and had kind of written off and climbed up a tree. And Jesus looked up and said, tonight we're eating together. Yeah, that one. Jesus takes his table and expands it. He makes room for the other at the table, the person that we don't even think belongs there. And you know what? The new table, the bigger table, it looks just as nice as the old one, and it can fit more people. Literally, the bigger table can take more chairs. There is room at your table for more than you think.
Look, it really comes down to this. You and I can't put the phone back together, okay? And we can't depend on the law to put the phone back together. The law's job is to tell us that something is wrong with the phone. And when we start to read Romans and we start to realize what has been said in here, we begin to realize that there is way more room at the table than we thought. We've been so judgmental. We have ostracized people away from the table of God that should never have been ostracized away. Let's read Romans 1 together. The passage at the end of this chapter helps us understand what Paul is really calling us to. And in fact, it's going to go so far as to say in chapter 2, he's going to flip it on its head and surprise us all. He's going to say, you have been judging all these people. He makes this list of people that we know are in the wrong. They're sinners. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, he goes on to say, so don't you dare judge them, because you do the exact same things.
They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And the they that Paul is talking about is the wicked people. But here, pay attention to Romans 2. He says this, you, therefore, and this is you who he's writing the letter to, so the Gentiles and the Jewish believers, you, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things.
We need to remember that the table opens up, the table expands, and expands in such a way that the only way that you and I have a seat at the table is that it was expanded for us. Do you understand that? The table was set for the Jewish and Hebrew people only. Only after Jesus came, died on a cross, and gave a new commandment, did the table open up beyond that to include those who were not Jewish, who were not part of that historical Hebrew identity. You and I are the Gentile converts. We have a seat at the table because it's been opened for us. When we start to live in a way that has an open table, when we start to live in a way that doesn't depend on a checklist or the law to fix the phone, it confuses the world. Truly. You see, the book of Romans and what Paul was writing to them, what Paul was commanding them, is not just meant to be, living ethically and making good decisions and being a good person. It's much more than that. The way that we live and we follow Jesus, it ends up actually being an alternative lifestyle, a way that shows the world that there is a different way than following Rome. It confuses the Roman world. And so here's what I want to close with today. Here's my example for you. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. What does Jesus tell you? That's not my way. If somebody slaps you, turn the other cheek. Literally, offer them to slap the other one. Make it match. Okay, the person who's slapping you is going to go, oh, this person's crazy. What in the world's going on? Okay, if a soldier comes up to you and commands you, by law, carry my stuff for 1 mile, when you get to the end of that mile, the soldier's probably looking around for the next person they can command to take their stuff. But when you get to the end of that mile, you just keep carrying their stuff for another mile, and they're going, what in the world is wrong with this person? They're carrying it for 2 miles. They're going the extra mile. We actually say that in our culture, right? Boy, you really went the extra mile. When we actually follow these commandments to love our neighbor, to put our power and privilege aside, or to use our power and privilege for others rather than over others, when we follow the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're others-centered, we're Christ-centered, when we are Christo-formed, it confuses the world. It offers an alternative lifestyle to the world around us. And that's what this book of Romans is all about. It's so easy for us to get locked into judgmentalism. We read Romans 1, where it talks about all these different types of sinners that are out there. And so we end up judging one another so harshly for all these sins, and yet we are out there committing the same sins. It's ridiculous. Let's put aside the judgmentalism. Let's open up the table and realize that there are those who were born not under grace that come under grace, and their entire lives change. Let's realize that when we live this out, it makes the world stop. For a moment, they go, what in the world is wrong with those people? They don't look like them. They look like Jesus. You get it? When we look like Jesus, it changes the world around us. Folks, this is what we have to be about. This is what we have to do. And you and I need to adopt it right now, today. Because right now and today, it stands to change the world around us. Are you with me? Can I get an amen while you're sitting in your living room? Let's stop the world for a moment. Let's make it pause. Let's make it second guess. Let's make it ask questions. What's wrong with these people? Not because we're weird, but because we are willing to put aside power and privilege and serve one another. We're loving one another. Let's be a people, let's be a community that's focused on that. Would you pray with me?
Hi, this is Pastor Nick. Thanks for listening. I hope something that you heard today was very helpful. If you want to connect with us further, feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or our website, kanoichurch.org. Sure, I'm glad we're in this together.